Hello everyone, welcome to Eng Lang Pro's YouTube channel. If you're new here, we're a team of tutors who've done the VCE English Language course. We've all scored a raw 45 or above, and we're here to help you guys get the absolute most you can out of this subject, learn the most you can about things like language acquisition and about Australian English and linguistics in general throughout your VCE. So if you're in year 10 or 11 or you're reviewing before your year 12 exam, welcome. We're here to cover some basics. We're here to cover Metalanguage subsystems at the moment. And if you're just starting VCE English Language, this is a great place because this is really going to be the basics that you guys need to cover for your entire VCE and beyond if you study linguistics in uni. So, welcome. We've just covered phonetics and phonology. The last video I put out was on sound production, which is phonetics and phonology. And we're moving just one step up into the whole entire creation of language into subsections of words, which is morphology. So let me define it for you. The VCE study design says, morphology is the study of the internal structure of words and the processes by which words are formed. Morphemes are the smallest unit of linguistic meaning or function. So what do they mean by that? They mean that if you take a lexeme, which is a word, and you chop it up into the smallest possible pieces that you can, where each piece still has some sort of meaning, whether that be grammatical only, or whether that actually be some sort of semantic meaning, it has meaning in our society today, those are morphemes. But if we go down here, this is a kind of a more easy way to understand it. It's Lego. Building blocks of words. We piece them together to make full words. For example, unrelenting, where you've got un, that's a prefix, relent, which is the middle kind of core root word, and then ing, which is a suffix. And you might be saying, Tori, ing doesn't have meaning. And I would say, actually, it does. It doesn't stand alone. It's bound. It can't stand by itself and have meaning. But ing by itself has grammatical meaning where it creates a verb form, an ongoing verb form, like relent to relenting. All right, so moving on, let's talk about the study design meta-language that they've given us in this beautiful table. So we've got morphemes and morphological overgeneralization. So this is only relevant in year 11, but it's knowledge that you're going to need anyway. And then you've got word formation processes and hypocoristic use of suffixes, which is part of year 12 core knowledge. So before we get into it, I just want to specify that in this study design, unfortunately, they've been kind enough to create two different types of word formation processes. You've got morphological word formation processes and lexical word formation processes. I would highly recommend you guys go to the VCAR pages website for English language and print out the meta-language tables so you can clearly see. So this is word formation processes for morphology, which I've got here, and there's also word formation processes for lexicology. It's important that you guys understand what each actual subsystem means. So for phonetics and phonology, that has patterning as well. Morphological patterning, syntactic patterning, semantic patterning. If you're able to understand what each subsystem actually means by itself, you'll be able to remember the patterning from that. So talking to my year 12s in particular here, if you're asked about morphological patterning and word formation processes, how are you going to remember that these ones here on the screen are morphological word formation processes, and the other, I think, 4 lexical word formation processes are not morphological patterning? And the way you will remember that is that morphology is about the subsections of words, and lexicology is just about words. So if you know subsystems and their definitions, especially something like semantics and syntax, they both start with S, makes it a bit difficult. But if you can go, okay, syntax I know is about sentences, semantics I know is about meaning of words, then you'll be much better equipped to actually be able to answer any sort of patterning question. I've also made a subsystems patterning video before, so hopefully word formation processes, if you're in year 12, will be pretty familiar to you already, but you can watch this as many times as you need to, and that one as well as many times as you need to. So let's go through. We will be covering both Year 11 and Year 12 content for morphology today. Just drop something. So let's get straight into it. Let's get cracking. So morphemes. What is the definition of a morpheme? Building blocks of words, as said before. But I've kind of mentioned, I think I've mentioned prefixes and suffixes. Those fall under the heading of an affix. So it comes from the word to affix something to something else, right? You're just adding a morpheme to a root or stem of a word to create another word. And that word could be very similar to the original word's meaning, or it could be quite different. They're bound morphemes, which we'll get to in a second. But knowing affixes and knowing morphemes need their own individual, they need their own meaning, whether that be grammatical or semantic. Knowing that, I want you guys to pause this video, have a think. In anti-disestablishmentarianism, how many morphemes do you see? And I remember in Year 11, I got this word, and we had quite a long debate in our class about whether the prefix "an" counts here, because "an" by itself is a prefix, right? It means the opposite, just like "un" sometimes. But because that would leave "t" by itself, and that doesn't have any grammatical meaning as a prefix, that means "anti" has to be the entire prefix, not "an," even though we were looking for the smallest units. So it's complicated, debatable, one might say, but I want you guys to spend a few minutes thinking about where are the smallest units of this word and how many are there and how many can I list out, and think about what are the meanings of each as well. So have a sec to do that. All right, so these are the ones I have: anti, dis, establish, ment, Aryan, ism. So anti is a prefix meaning against. Dis meaning not, also a prefix. Establish is the root word, which we'll get to that definition in a minute. Ment, which creates a noun. Aryan, which creates a person. And ism, which creates an ideology. So see how each of these morphemes have their own meaning, even if they don't stand on their own, which let's talk about now. So what is a root? The root in anti-disestablishmentarianism is establish. That's where the core meaning of the word comes from. So, for example, in unrelenting, the core root morpheme, is relent, because that's the meaning that we're then altering with our affixes that we're adding on. What is a free morpheme? These can stand on their own. And you might be saying, root, free, I don't see the difference, which is valid. They overlap a lot of the time. But because there are some tiny little instances in which they don't, for example, sieve in receive, perceive, sieve is the root morpheme, but it doesn't stand on its own, so it's not free. That is too complicated for where we're at in VCE English Language. If you're going to talk about root or free morphemes in your SACs or exams, just think, with the word that you're given, is the core meaning created from this morpheme, in which case it is a root? And does that stand on its own? If yes, then it's also a free morpheme. So just think about them as their separate definitions, apply their separate definitions to each morpheme that you're trying to consider, whether it's free or root. Bound. I keep mentioning it. What is a bound? It's just the opposite of a free morpheme. So all affixes are, that's not quite true. Prefixes and suffixes generally are bound morphemes, so they don't stand on their own. They can't make any sense. For example, un and ing in unrelenting, they don't make sense on their own. But when you add them to a free or a root morpheme, as in relent, then they make sense because they've changed that meaning of relent to unrelenting. There are two types. There's inflectional and derivational. Inflectional bound affixes, they do not change the core meaning of the word. So what do I mean? I mean they can change, for example, plurality or tense. So those are grammatical changes that they're making. For example, the verb to swim, if I add the suffix on the end there, swims, I'm still talking about the verb to swim. I'm saying Samantha swims. I'm still talking about the verb swimming. I haven't changed anything except added a little suffix. They're a grammatical thing. They don't make any changes to the core meaning, unlike derivational bound morphemes. Derivational morphemes do change the meaning. For example, they can completely make something the opposite, as in unhappiness. Un is a prefix that is derivational. And also, for me, I found it really helpful to think about, does this change the word class? Because if it does, then it's also derivational. Even though you're still talking about swimming, for example, if you take swim and add the suffix and make swimmer, even though you're still talking about swimming, you've created a new word class. You've created the noun of the person doing the verb. So that's derivational. Come back to this. It's pretty complicated. Go over it a few times, but you'll get it. Trust. All right. So I'm going to collapse this because it's such a huge amount of notes. Let's talk about overgeneralization. So this is part of year 11 child language acquisition, I think, which is super fun and interesting. But I digress. Overgeneralization is when we take a grammatical rule that we've learned, but we then extend it to new words that it doesn't apply to. So, for example, if someone learns English for the first time or a child learns English for the first time, we learn that the suffix s creates plural, like tissue to tissues. But we might then go on to say, oh, that's a rule with no exceptions, famous last words, and say something like sheep, sheeps, or foot, foots, when in actual fact, we've got different grammatical rules there. So, this is important not only for child language acquisition, but when you do have people learning English as a second language, which you might come across in things like ethnolex in year 12, do kind of pay attention to the transcripts that you're given. Is anything non-standard spelt out? Like, if you can see something that's spelled incorrectly, then you might think, oh, is this a representation of their identity as someone learning English as a second language or a child learning English for the first time? So super, super cool. Shame that it's really only part of the 11th study design. All right. So that's the year 11 stuff. Let's get into the year 12 stuff. As I mentioned, morphological word formation processes. Word formation, creating of words. Lexicology is the study of words itself, and where morphology is more about the parts of words. So it does make sense that lexicology has some of its own word formation processes. These ones specifically are about like chopping and changing words, hence they're morphological. So starting off with affixation, if you're going into the exam just wanting to know the bare basics, this is the one I would pick for morphological patterning. It's just any affix. Oh, I forgot to tell you guys about infixes, by the way. They're not really part of standard Australian English, but if you're being a little bit dramatic, you might say something like fan bloody tastic, where bloody, you've just plopped it straight in the middle of the word. It's an infix compared to a prefix at the start, suffix at the end. So, sorry about that. Moving on so that's affixation in morphological patterning. You can pick any word that has any sort of affix and talk about that, how they've created that word. Abbreviation and shortening. So both of them involve chopping up a word to make it shorter. Abbreviation is generally a bit more formal, and if it has a full stop, that's more likely to be abbreviation. For example, doctor or avenue with dots. Av or dr with a full stop is more likely to be an abbreviation. Whereas shortening, you've just got a long word chopped up, for example, fridge from refrigerator. It's a bit less formal and there's no full stops in it. So these are, especially shortening, you can link that to register, so formality in particular. If you're saying something like refrigerator, you're probably going to be in a more formal context than someone just saying fridge. Compounding. So compounding, it's nice to kind of know what this word means because it comes up again in syntax later, but you're taking two or more free morphemes. So they have they can stand on their own, they are equally weighted, but you just put them together without changing them to create a new word, like toothbrush, friendship, notebook. This is where you can kind of argue with your teacher about which one is the root morpheme. But if you do think about it, even though they are both free, one of them is a bit more of a descriptor. So tooth is describing what sort of brush it is, and note is describing the book. So I would argue the latter one is the root morpheme, but they're both free morphemes. They stand on their own. They have their own meaning. All right, now blending. Blending is when, similar to compounding, but you've taken out some of the sounds. So brunch is the most common one that I think of. It's not breakfast lunch, which would be the compounded version, but they've taken out some of the sound to make brunch. So it's easy to say. This is all about efficiency. Back formation. So this one is pretty rare. You don't really analyze it because unless you're given the etymological history of a word, you're not going to really be able to say for sure that something's back formation rather than affixation. And that's because back formation is the process of creating a new word by removing an affix instead of giving one. So, for example, I would have thought we had the word edit first, and then we created editor by adding the OR suffix. But with etymology, so the history of how this word was made, we can see in actual fact we had editor first, and then we created edit. So it's back formation, meaning kind of backwards to the way that you would expect. Again, you probably won't, because you can't know for certain just by picking out from a transcript whether something's back formed or not. So this is something more to do with your knowledge on maybe an assignment or a conversion of word class. So this is where you're not actually adding any affixes or changing the word with any morphemes, but you are changing the word class, the grammatical category. So we'll go over word classes in lexicology, but a few key ones are nouns, verbs, adverbs, and adjectives. And in general, conversion of word class will involve changing from one of these to another without adding or taking away any affixes. So for example, the verb to run and run the noun. Or Google. Google, the proper noun, is also now a verb, to Google something. So that's conversion of word class. Initialisms. So it's important to keep initialisms and acronyms separate in your brain. So initialisms are a type of abbreviation where you say out every letter. So think about it. What does initial mean? Talking about this specific different letters. Acronym is when you say it as a word, like NASA or radar or sonar. Then we've got contraction. So what is a contraction? Hopefully you guys have heard of this before in your previous schooling, but group of words, phrase that's been shortened, and usually an apostrophe is used to create one word out of it. So don't from do not is a classic. Or it's for it is. And those are pretty easy to pick out and analyze. They don't carry as much kind of interesting background as something like compounding, blending, shortening does, but it's just as valid as arguing about lexical efficiency and being able to talk quickly and easily as all of those. So it's creating less speaking time basically, and it's also more informal to say don't rather than do not. So those are morphological word formation processes. They all involve kind of changing specific parts of a word or morphemes. Now, just quickly, the very last thing they've listed in the study design under Metalanguage for morphology is hypocoristic suffixes. And I've written here typical Aussie because I've taken the word Australia, shortened it, and then added the suffix E on the end. And hypocoristic suffixes are when we do exactly that. We shorten a word down and then we add the E or O suffix. And it's a diminutive that shows a lot of kind of love, really free-spirited, super chill, relaxed, laid back. And that's all things that we like to describe ourselves as Australians. So some examples are tradie from tradesman, bicky from biscuit, bottle-o from bottle shop. And for your interest, etymologically, hypocorism comes from ancient Greek, which means to call by endearing names. which is kind of a cute little thing to know. So those are super important when it comes to Australian English, which you cover in Unit 4. But if you see something like this in a transcript, you can take that to represent someone's cultural identity as an Australian or as an Aussie. So I hope this has been really helpful for you guys, and good luck for all your study and really building up the basic blocks from the ground up for year 10s and 11s. And I really hope that you've enjoyed and learned something. So all the best with your studies, and I'll see you next time. Bye!